Georgia, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Lima Bravo 7, Lima Juliet.
SSB 7, Lima Juliet 59.
Thank you, 5973.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Kilo Charlie 1, Lima Alpha Alpha.
DC1 Lima Alpha 59.
59 Massachusetts, thank you.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Sugar Queen 8, Bravo.
Sugar Queen again.
Sugar Queen 8, Bravo.
Sugar Queen 8.
Sugar Queen 8, Bravo Whiskey Mike.
EG1WWA 59.
509, thank you.
Thanks, Georgia.
Hello, the Sugar. Echo Alpha 8, Charlie Whiskey Alpha.
Charlie Whiskey Alpha 59.
Hello, ciao.
Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Mike.
United Norway.
United America 3, Charlie Sierra.
UA3 Charlie Sierra 59.
America, Italy.
Casilla de Cidania. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Mike.
United America.
Mike again.
Italy United.
Mike Sierra.
Mike 0, Delta X3 Lima.
Mike Sierra DXL 59.
QSL 59, thank you.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Kilo 7, Uniform Delta Oscar.
UK Delta Kilo 7 UDO 59.
You 509, so thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Delta Oscar 3. Delta Oscar 3.
Oscar 2 Echo Mike Romeo.
Delta Oscar 2 Echo Mike Radio 59. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta 4 Juliet Radio.
EG4 Juliet Radio 59. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Radio for Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. 5 and 9 can I give you back?
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Papa Alpha 0 Bravo 59.
Papa Alpha 0 Bravo 59.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
United America 3, America, Italy United.
United America 3, America Italy United 59.
United America 3, America, United 59.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar November 3 Papa Alpha Sierra.
Ocean Norway 3 Papa Alpha Sierra 59.
59 Postal, thank you.
Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Alpha 4.
4 Echo Quebec Foxtrot.
4 Echo Quebec Fox 59. 73 Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Indian Tango. Delta Alpha Tango only.
India Zulu 2, Alpha Delta Tango.
Delta Alpha Tango only. Sierra Papa 3 Delta Alpha Tango 5 and 9. Who is the Italy?
India Zulu 2, Alpha Delta Tango.
Italy Zulu 2 Alpha Delta Tango 59.
Roger, 59.
Grazie, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Tango Alpha 0, Alpha Charlie Lima.
Alpha 0 Alpha Charlie Lima 5 and 9.
59, thank you.
Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Lima 1, Sierra Kilo Bravo.
Delta Lima 1 Sierra Kilo Bravo 5 and 9.
Thank you, 59 for you.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Hotel Bravo 9, Hotel Sierra Juliet.
HP9 Hotel Sierra Juliet 5 and 9.
59, thanks.
Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Oscar November 3 again.
Oscar November 3, Alpha Charlie Delta.
Ocean Norway 3 Alpha Charlie Delta 5 and 9.
Thank you, 509.
Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Hotel Bravo 9, India Mike Quebec.
HP9 India Mike Quebec 5 and 9.
59 also.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Lima 3 Alpha Quebec.
Delta Lima 3 AQ 5 and 9.
Oscar Mike 4.
Delta Lima 3 Alpha Quebec 5 and 9.
Roger, thank you.
Kilo.
Thank you, Oscar Mike 4 again.
Oscar Mike 4, Kilo.
Ocean Mary 4 KK 5 and 9.
59,
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. SP3 India Mike Bravo 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Lima 6 Juliet Charlie Bravo.
Delta Lima 6 ACB 5 and 9.
Thank you, also 5 and 9.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Italy Victor 3, Alpha Victor Yankee.
Alpha Victor Yankee. India Victor Yankee.
Italy Victor 3, Golf Victor Yankee.
EV3 Golf Victor Yankee 59.
59, ciao.
Thank you, 9 Alpha 2. 9 Alpha 2, Uniform Italy 5 and 9. 9 Alpha 2, United Italy 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Golf 4 Delta, Sugar Delta.
E4 DFD 5 and 9. E4 DFD 5 and 9.
Roger, 59, thank you.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Hotel Alpha 7 Zulu Bravo 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Italy Whiskey 2, Oscar Eco Florida.
Italy Whiskey 2, Oscar Echo Fox 59.
59, grazie.
Grazie, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Juliet 0, Bravo Sierra.
EG1WWA 59.
597.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. PT1 Fox Oscar Echo 59. Obrigado, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. Charlie Sierra 7 Alpha, Uniform Charlie 59. Charlie Sierra 7 Alpha, Union Tango, obrigado. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Mike, Hotel Bravo 9, Tango, Hotel Papa.
Hotel Bravo 9.
Hotel Bravo 9, Tango, Hotel Papa.
69 Tango, Hotel Papa, 59.
The Alpha 59.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Alpha Lima.
Delta Lima 1.
Delta Lima 1, Sierra Sierra.
Delta Lima 1, Sierra Sierra 59.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Mike 0, Alpha Lima, Alpha.
Mike 0, ALA 59.
Obrigado.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Sierra Papa 6 again. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Charlie 5, Echo.
Delta Charlie 5.
Romeo Echo.
Delta Charlie 5 Radio Echo 59.
59 close for you, 73.
Thank you, Hotel Alpha 5.
Hotel Alpha 5, Oscar Bravo.
Hotel Alpha 5, Oscar Bravo 59. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar November 3, Yankee Alpha.
Ocean Norway 3, Yankee Alpha 59. Ocean Norway 3, Yankee Alpha 59. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Radio 09, Whiskey United.
Radio 09, Whiskey United 59.
Thank you, 5 by 9.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Papa 6, Charlie Gold Radio.
Sierra Papa 6, Charlie Gold Radio 59.
Sierra Papa 3, Charlie Gold Radio.
SP3, Charlie Gold Radio 59. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar Solo 1, Kilo Victor Mike.
Ocean Zulu 1, Kilo Victor Mike 59.
Thank you, 59.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15.
Delta Oscar 1, Kilo Romeo.
Delta Oscar 1, Kilo Radio 59.
59.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Hotel Bravo 9, India Mike Quebec.
HP9 India Mike Quebec QSOV 459.
Thank you, 59, 73.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
India Zulu 3, Charlie India X-Ray.
73 Charlie India X-Ray 59.
59, grazie.
Grazie. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Papa 3, Alpha Whiskey India.
SP3 Alpha Whiskey India 59. Thank you. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Papa Echo 4, Mike Alpha Radio.
Papa Echo 4, Mike Alpha Radio 59.
Thank you, 59 also.
Thank you. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Oscar 9, Alpha Bravo Charlie.
09 Alpha Bravo Charlie 59.
59, thank you.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
November Echo Tango.
SPA November Echo Tango 59.
Also Fabry 90.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Ocean Echo 1, Delta X-ray uniform.
Ocean Echo 1, DX2 59.
Thank you, 59 plus 10.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Y a 2 Delta Papa Tierra 59. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Charlie again. Delta Charlie 0, Echo Charlie 59. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Italy Uniform 2, Hotel Echo Yankee.
You do Hotel Echo Yankee 59.
59, gracias.
Gracias, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Hotel Bravo 3, Yankee Delta Tango.
HP3 Yankee Delta Tango 59.
59 here in Bristol, Micro OP. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
1-0, Bravo Hotel.
Bravo, Italia Kilo 0, Bravo Hotel 59.
Ciao, grazie, 73.
Grazie, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Germany, Radio 4 Germany Tango 59.
Hotel Tango, Regional Way 4, Honolulu Tango, report 5 by 9, over.
Roger, Radio Norway 4 Hotel Tango 59. 73 спасибо.
Romeo Alpha 1 Charlie Yankee.
Radio Alpha 1 Charlie Yankee 59.
Okay, for 59, thank you.
73 Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Golf 0 Japan, Uniform Radio.
EG1WWA 59. Golf 0 Japan Uniform Radio 59.
Yeah, thank you. You're also 59.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. 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 CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Echo. Yankee Oscar 3 again. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Charlie Yankee November, what's the prefix? YU3CYN 59. Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Roger, Yankee Oscar 3, Charlie Yankee November 59. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yankee Oscar 8, right? Okay, thanks for the correction. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Delta. Echo Delta. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Sierra Yankee 9, Echo Fox Hotel 59. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Golf 7 Lima.
Delta Golf 7 Lima 59.
59, thank you.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
United November 7, Lima Echo Whiskey.
United Norway 7 Lima Echo Whiskey 59.
Lima Echo Whiskey. You might know, good luck.
73, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Hotel Papa Foxtrot.
Papa Foxtrot.
It's for Delta Hotel 8 Papa Foxtrot. I repeat, Delta Hotel 8 Papa Foxtrot.
Roger, Delta Hotel 8 Papa Fox 59. Delta Hotel 8 Papa Fox 59, thank you. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Germany 7, Fox Sierra Delta.
7 Fox Sierra Delta 59.
Good afternoon.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar November 6, Mexico, America.
Ocean Norway 6 Mike Alpha 59.
59, my friend.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Bye.
Delta Kilo 8, Delta Alpha Yankee.
Delta Kilo 8, Delta Alpha Yankee 59.
Thank you. For the point, 7-3.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar, that's taking time for Victoria.
Ocean Retriever, Tango Victor India 5-9.
5-5-30-33.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. Kilo Alpha 1, India Echo 5-9. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Yeah, yes, that's it. How does it go?
Yankee Oscar 6 Alpha Golf Golf 5-9. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
United Echo Romeo over.
United Echo Radio, what's the prefix?
Radio America 4, United Echo Romeo over.
Radio America 4, United Echo Radio 5-9.
Thank you very much.
10-3 pasiva. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Kilo Echo. Kilo Alpha 1, India Echo 5-9. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Italia Uniform 3, Sierra X-Ray Juliet.
Italia Uniform 3, Sierra X-Ray Juliet 59.
59, è corretta, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Whiskey Alpha, Roger.
Corretto, grazie. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. 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 Wow. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar Echo 5, Sierra Juliet, Mexico.
Ocean Echo 5, Sierra Juliet, Mike 5-9.
Okay, thank you. 5-9-7-3.
Thank you. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Yankee 9, Echo Foxtrot Hotel.
Sierra Yankee 9, Echo Fox Hotel 5-9, QS34. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. 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 Mexico, Quebec again.
Romeo Alpha 6, Mexico, Quebec.
Radio America 6 and Q 5-9.
5-9.
Thank you. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Delta Oscar 90K 5-9. Delta Oscar 9 Tango Kilo 5-9.
5-9-73.
Thanks. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15.
Italy United 4, Italy.
Italia Uniform 4, Radio Whiskey India 59.
5-9, grazie.
Grazie. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. 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 CQ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. 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 Thank you. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Kilo 5, Kilo November.
KFIK and 5-9.
Roger, I'll do 59-73.
Thanks for the tuning. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. 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 CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra.
Ending Sierra. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Echo Golf 1.
CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Oscar 2 Tango Lima Sierra.
Delta Oscar 2, Tango Lima Sierra, 5 and 9.
Yeah, 5-9, thank you.
Thank you. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar Mike 1.
Oscar Mike 1.
Oscar Mike 1.
Only Oscar Mike 1. Listen, guys. Oscar Mike 1.
1 Echo.
Oscar Mike 1, Echo, Echo, 5 and 9.
Echo also 5-9.
Thanks. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Italy United 4 Queen Oscar Delta.
Più 4 qui Echo Oscar Delta 5-9.
5-9 più per te, grazie mille, ciao.
Grazie. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Lima 9, Romeo Papa.
Delta Lima 9, Radio Papa, 5 and 9.
Many thanks, 5-9, also 73, good luck.
Thank you. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Sugar Papa 7, Sierra United Mike.
SB7, FUM, 5 and 9.
59, thank you.
Thanks. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Papa Alpha 3, Romeo.
Delta Kilo 1 Juliet.
Papa Alpha 3, Romeo.
3, Romeo Whiskey Golf, QSL.
Roger. PA3, RWJ, 5 and 9.
You're 592, QSL.
Thanks. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Kilo 1 Juliet.
Delta Kilo 1, Sierra Juliet, 5 and 9. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Delta Kilo 1, Sierra Juliet. Listen, guys. DK1, Sierra Juliet, 5 and 9.
5-9, also 73 and good luck.
Thanks. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Uniform Bravo 1 Alpha Uniform Alpha.
UB1, Alpha, Uniform Alpha, 5 and 9.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. United Sugar 5. US 5, Italy, Mexico Delta, 5 and 9. United Sierra 5, Italy, Whiskey Delta, 5 and 9. Thank you. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Yankee again. Yankee Charlie 9, Mike Foxtrot Delta, Salamat Malam, 5 and 9. Prima Cafe QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Ocean 9.
3 Delta. Ending Delta.
United America 3 Delta.
United 3 Delta, 5 and 9.
Roger, many thanks. United 3 Delta, you're 59, 73, good luck.
73, спасибо. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Papa Alpha 3 Hotel Sierra Mike.
PA3 Hotel Sierra Mike, 5 and 9.
Thank you, 5-9 Alex.
Thanks. You recognize the Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Sugar 5, India, November Delta.
US 5, India, Norway Delta, 5 and 9. Thank you. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
United
Charlie, what's the prefix?
Italy Uniform 2 Delta Oscar Zulu.
QRX frequency, please. Uniform Charlie, United Radio, question mark, Uniform Charlie again.
3, 1, 2, 3, United Radio 3, United Charlie.
Roger, you are 3, Uniform Charlie, 5 and 9, thank you. QRZ.
Delta Oscar Zulu.
Delta Oscar Zulu, full call, please.
Italy Uniform 2 Delta Oscar Zulu.
Imposible con vosotros, si you do it, Delta Oscar Zulu, 5-9, gracias.
5-9, gracias.
Delta Golf 9, Fox, Delta Mike.
Delta Golf 9, Fox Delta Mike, 5 and 9.
5 and 9, 73.
Thank you, Lima Zulu.
Zulu 2 Kilowatt Victoria.
Lima Zulu 2 Kilo Victoria, 5 and 9.
Lima Zulu 2 Kilowatt Victoria. 59, thank you.
Thank you. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Mike 4, Hotel Charlie Mike.
Sierra Mike 4, Hotel Charlie Mike 5 and 9.
QSL 5 and 9.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Italy Kilo 4 Lima Delta Sierra.
Italy Kilo 4, Lima Delta Sierra 5 9.
Grazie 5 9.
QRZ.
Italy Delta Lima 9, Oscar Bravo Uniform.
Delta Lima 9, Oscar Bravo Uniform 5 and 9.
Patron 73.
Thank you, QRZ.
Italy Uniform 5, Radio Lima Kilo.
SM5, Radio Lima Kilo 5 and 9.
Also 5 and 9, thank you.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Radio Delta 3 Alpha Charlie.
Radio Delta 3 Alpha Charlie 5 and 9.
5973.
Thank you, QRZ.
Radio 2 United Zulu.
Radio 2 United Zulu 5 and 9.
QSL 5 9.
Thank you, QRZ. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Charlie United 7 Charlie Lima.
QZ Charlie Lima 5 9.
5 9, gracias.
Obrigado, QRZ.
Lima Italy Golf.
Lima Italy Golf, what's the prefix? No. Lima Italy Golf, give me the prefix. Lima Italy Golf, your call.
Radio Lima Italy Golf.
Lima Italy Golf, one more time, what's the prefix? What's your call?
Radio 6.
Radio 6, Lima Italy Golf 5 and 9. 73, спасибо. Grazie, QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Guatemala.
Fox 6, Alpha Sugar Golf 5 and 9.
Bye bye.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. United Radio 5, Fox Echo Oscar 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Sierra Papa 9, Charlie Alpha Lima 5 and 9.
Charlie Sierra 7 Alpha Uniform Tango.
Charlie Sierra 7 Alpha Uniform Tango 5 9. Obrigado, QRZ, EG1. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Papa 9, Tango Papa.
59 Tango Papa 5 and 9.
Bye bye, salute.
Thank you, another Sierra Papa. Sierra Papa 9, Victor Oscar Uniform 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Whiskey Papa 4, Radio Florida.
WP4, Radio Frecuencia 59. Saludos, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
India Lima Zulu 2 Sierra Tango Zulu.
Lima Zulu 2, Sierra Tango Zulu 5 and 9.
First 9 sir.
Thank you, QRZ. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar Echo 3 India Papa Uniform.
Ocean Echo 3, India Papa Uniform 5 and 9.
Thank you, Jose 59.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Sugar Papa 1, Norway, Quebec, Norway.
SC1MQF 5 and 9.
59.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Kilo 3 Sierra November Oscar.
C3, Sierra November Oscar 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Bravo 7 Mike Alpha.
Delta Bravo 7, Mike Alpha 5 and 9.
Okay, many thanks. 5 9, good luck.
Thank you, Echo Alpha 8, Echo Alpha 8. 8 Echo Delta 5 9, gracias, QRZ. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
9 Kilo 2
9 Kilo 2, 9K2.
9K2 AK Sugar.
9K2 Echo Sugar 5 and 9.
5 9, good luck.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
9 Zulu Mike Radio.
YU9 Zulu Mike Radio 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Hotel America.
Hotel America.
United America 3 America. Hotel America.
UA3 America, Hotel America 5 and 9.
5 and 9, 73.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Italy Uniform 3 Romeo Hotel Alpha Portable.
Italy Uniform 3, Radio Hotel Alpha 59. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Station, very bad condition. Thank you, 73 and good extra Italy Uniform 3 Romeo Hotel Alpha.
Grazie a cura di te, QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Radio 3 Papa Italy. Sorry, I missed the last letter. Radio 3 Papa Italy.
Papa Italy Zulu, Papa Italy Zulu.
Roger, Radio 3 Papa Italy Zulu 5 and 9.
59 UA for QSL.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Hotel American Charlie, what's the prefix? Yankee Oscar 2, Alpha Oscar Charlie, QSL. Yankee Oscar 4, Alpha Oscar Charlie 5 and 9. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. CQ15, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Delta Fox 2, Mike Sierra November 5 and 9. Tango Florida 2, Mike Sierra November Iceland 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Queen number 5, Mike Radio Hotel.
SQ5 Mike Radio Hotel 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Lima Zulu 5, Echo Oscar.
Lima Zulu 5, Echo Oscar 5 and 9.
Thank you, 5 times, good luck.
Thanks, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Oscar 8, Romeo Gold.
Delta Oscar 8, Radio Gold 5 and 9. Thanks, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Quebec 1, Mike November Charlie.
SQ1 MMC 5 and 9.
Sugar Queen 1, Mike November Charlie.
Thank you, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Yankee Ontario 4, America, Canada. America Delta Canada. Roger, YU4 Alpha Charlie 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Ending Whiskey. QRZ, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Delta Oscar 3, Oscar India 5 and 9. Thanks, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Yankee Oscar 2, full code. YU2 DSA 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
4 Lima 8 Alpha.
4 Lima 8 Alpha 5 and 9.
592, bye-bye.
Thanks, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Fox 9, Alpha Oscar.
Delta Fox 9 Alpha Oscar 5 and 9.
59 plus 73.
Thank you, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Lima 3, Yankee Echo.
Delta Lima 3, Yankee Echo 5 and 9.
Thank you, 5973.
Thank you, QRZ. And November Kilo again. EG2 NK 59.
59, thank you.
Thank you, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Kilo Bravo 3, Whiskey Delta.
JB3, Whiskey Delta 5 and 9.
5-9, good luck.
Thanks, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Mexico 3, United X-Ray Juliet.
And 3, United X-Ray Juliet 5 and 9.
Thank you, also 5 and 9.
Thank you, QRZ. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
2 Echo 0 CPD.
2 Echo 0 again.
Yes.
2 Echo 0.
Papa Victor.
2 0 PPV 5 and 9.
590 Delta.
Thanks, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Papa Alpha 3 Eagle Juliet Kilo.
DA3, DJK 5 and 9.
No, 5 and 9 Kilo.
Thanks, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Gold 5 Delta Entry.
EM5 DDX 5 and 9.
Roger, you 5-9, thank you.
Thanks, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Oscar 1, Bravo Tango Whiskey.
EM1 Bravo Tango Whiskey 5 and 9. Thanks, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Alto Charlie Unión Florida 59. Gracias, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Lima 1, Golf Bravo.
Delta Lima 1 GB 5 and 9.
You also 5 and 9. Thank you very much. I love you.
Thank you, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Italy, United 4, Queen Oscar Delta.
U4 Quebec Oscar Delta 59.
59 più per te, ciao, grazie mille, ciao.
Grazie, Pigeon Lady.
Oscar Echo 6 Bravo India Delta.
Ocean Echo 6 Bravo India Delta 5 and 9.
Perfect, so thank you. 73, go back to the house.
Thank you, 7388. Bye-bye. QRZ, Echo Gold 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Hotel America 5, Golf Foxtrot.
Hotel America 5 Golf Foxtrot 59.
Check your 59.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Ocean 6 Papa India Delta.
Ocean Echo 6 Papa India Delta 59.
59 loud and clear, complimenti, grazie, ciao ciao.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Anybody else? UB7 Ocean Germany Delta 59. 73 hasta arriba, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha CQ system.
1 Radio Lima.
Radio Lima.
Delta Fox 1 Radio Lima, you are 559, thanks.
Delta Fox 1 Radio Lima, also 59, thank you. QRZ, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Quebec 5 Alpha Charlie.
SQ5 Alpha Charlie 59.
59, thank you very much.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Papa number 2, Mike, Sierra Mike.
SP2 MFM 59.
Roger, thank you very much, 59 from Poland, ciao.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Oscar 5 Radio Juliet Hotel.
Delta Oscar 5 Radio Juliet Hotel 59.
Thanks a lot for the report of right now, 59+10, 59+10 for you.
Thank you, QRZ, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Papa 2, Golf Juliet India.
SP2 Golf Juliet India 59.
To attend you also 5973.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Radio Mexico, Mexico.
Radio Mexico Mexico, the prefix.
Alpha 3, Radio Mexico, Mexico, you're 59.
Radio America 3, Radio Mike Mike 59.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Lima 1, Hotel Tango Foxtrot.
Delta Lima 1 Hotel Tango Fox 59.
Delta, thank you, 59 also 70.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
United Whiskey 7, Charlie November.
United Whiskey 7, Charlie November 59. Thank you, QRZ, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Kilo Bravo E Yankee Tango Delta 59. Thank you, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Kilo 6, Mike, Quebec.
Delta Kilo 6 Mike Quebec 59.
59 also, thank you.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. United Tango 4 again.
Uniform Tango 4, Echo Lima. Uniform Tango.
United Tango 4 Echo Lima 59.
Okay, Roger, 10-3.
CMD, спасибо. QRZ, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Sierra Papa 9 Whiskey.
Sierra Papa 9.
Whiskey 9WLS 59.
59, thank you.
Thank you, QRZ, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Mike India 3, Japan Hotel Foxtrot.
Mike India 3, Japan Hotel Fox 59.
Thank you for 59, also 59, Charlie 3.
Thank you, QRZ, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Kilo 4, Mike Zulu.
Mike Zulu again.
Delta Kilo 4, Mike Zulu, you're 59.
Roger, DK4 Mike Zulu 59. Thank you, QRZ, EG1WWA. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. CQ15, Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Anybody else? Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Radio 3, Mike Bravo Delta, 5 and 9.
69, gracias.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Delta Oscar 1, Radio Lima, 5 and 9. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Alpha 6, Alpha Bravo.
Alpha Bravo again.
Delta Alpha 6, Alpha Bravo.
Delta Alpha 6, Alpha Bravo, 5 and 9.
Yeah, 5 and 9 too. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Oscar 1, Hotel Echo Yankee.
Delta Oscar 1, Hotel Echo Yankee, 5 and 9.
Thank you, 5 and 9 also, 7G.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Ending in November. And number 7 November.
Radio United 7 November.
Radio United 7 November, 5 and 9.
5 and 9,
I'm doing Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Kilo Mike 4. KM4WW, 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. 2 India Theater, Hotel Alpha Zulu, 5 and 9. Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Papa 8, Delta Radio.
SPA Delta Radio, 5 and 9. Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Golf Mike 0, Victor Echo Kilo.
Theater VEK, 5 and 9.
Roger, 5 and 9.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Oscar November 1. Ocean Orby 1 Delta America, 5 and 9. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Papa 2, Golf Radio Papa.
SP2 Golf Radio Papa, 5 and 9.
Good afternoon, also 5 night for you.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Ocean Echo 3, Radio Hotel Sierra, 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Mike 7, November Kilo Kilo.
And November Kilo Kilo, what is it called? Sierra Mike 7, November Kilo Kilo, 5 and 9. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Oscar 9 Tango November Tango.
AO9 TNT, 5 and 9.
You're 519-273.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
George 4, Whiskey Tango Delta.
G4WTD 509.
Many thanks, 59 plus, good morning.
Thanks, good morning. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
This is Delta Hotel 8, Papa Foxtrot.
Delta Hotel 8, Papa Foxtrot 509, QSOV4. We said Charlie Tango.
Charlie Tango, Alpha Zulu November, America Zulu November, que deu?
IFL, CT1 Alpha Zulu November 59, boa tarde.
59, obrigado.
Obrigado, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Echo 75 Radio Kilo Mike.
Echo 75 Radio Kilo Mike 509.
5960.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Anybody else? Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Sierra Papa 6, Uniform Victor Uniform 509. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Lima 5, Delta.
Delta Lima 5, Delta 509. Delta Lima 5 again?
Yes, Delta Lima 5, Delta Tango Lima.
Roger, Delta Lima 5, Delta Tango Lima 509.
Yes, many thanks. 509 also for you. Thank you. Good radio.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Oscar 1, Sierra Radio X-Ray.
Delta Oscar 1, Sierra Radio X-Ray 509.
Also 5973.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar Echo 3 Delta X-Ray Alpha.
Ocean Echo 3 DXA 509. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Italy Uniform 2, Lima Uniform Hotel.
You do Lima Uniform Hotel 59.
Nicolai, grazie mille, ciao.
Grazie, de Sierra Papa. SP5 Papa Bravo 509. Sierra Papa 5 Papa Bravo 509. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Echo Victor 1, Romeo.
Echo Victor 1 Radio 509.
Thanks, you 59. Good luck.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar Echo 8, X-Ray Sierra Papa.
Ocean Echo 8 X-Ray Sierra Papa 509.
59 for you, 73.
Thank you, QRZ.
November Guatemala.
November Golf, the full call please.
Sierra Papa 3, Juliet November Guatemala.
SP3J and G 509, thank you. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar Echo 8, Yankee Mexico Lima.
Ocean Echo 8 YML 509.
For you also 5973.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Papa 3.
Delta Oscar 9. Sierra Papa 3.
Juliet November Guatemala.
SP3 Julia November Golf 509 QSOV4. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Italy, Yankee Tango.
Italy.
Italy, Mike 0, India Yankee Tango.
Mike 0, India Yankee Tango 509. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Italy, Quebec 2, Charlie Ray.
Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Sugar Papa 7 Mike Oscar Charlie.
SP7 Mike Oscar Charlie 59.
59, thank you.
Thank you, QRZ.
Italia, Quebec 2, Charlie Ray.
Italia Quebec 2, Charlie X-Ray 59.
Nicolai, ciao.
QRZ.
Italy, Yankee Tango.
Italy Yankee Tango full call.
Mike 0 Italy Yankee Tango.
MM0 IYT 5-9, thank you. QRZ.
Sierra Papa 5 X-Ray Tango Golf.
SP5 X-Ray Tango Golf 5-9.
Thank you. Also 5973, good luck.
Thank you. QRZ.
November Papa 2 Tango.
November Papa 2 Tango 5-9.
November Papa 3 Tango. November Papa 3 Tango. 5-9.
Roger, MP3 Tango 5-9, gracias.
Thank you, Roger.
QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar November 6 Echo Mike.
Ocean Norway 6, Echo Mike 5-9.
You're also 59 set 3.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar Echo 1 Mike Bravo Alpha.
Ocean Echo 1, Mike Bravo Alpha
59.
5-9. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Lima Alpha 1 Papa Juliet.
Lima Alpha 1, Papa Juliet 5-9.
Roger 59.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Radio Delta 4, Florida Bravo.
Radio Delta 4, Florida Bravo 5-9. Radio Delta 4, Florida Bravo 5-9.
Roger. 5-9 also. 23.
Chem 3 Especial, QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Papa Echo 5 Whiskey.
E5W 5-9. Papa Echo 5, Whiskey 5-9.
Dus 59 in Central Finland 73 and good luck.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha, CQ15.
Oscar 9.
Number 9.
Thank you, Delta Oscar 9 Hotel Charlie.
Delta Oscar 9, Delta Oscar 9, Hotel Charlie 59.
Thank you, also loud and clear 73.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar Kilo 1 Foxtrot America.
Italia Whiskey 2, November Charlie Whiskey 59.
59, grazie.
Grazie, QRZ.
Oscar Kilo 1 Foxtrot America Victoria.
Okay, 1 Fox Alpha Victor 59.
India 2
Oh, Star Kilo 1 Fox Alpha Victor 59.
QSL you are 59, thank you.
Thank you. Italy Zulu 8. Italy Zulu 8.
London Foxtrot Italy.
Italia Zulu 8 Lima Fox India 59, grazie. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Oscar 8 Hotel Kilo.
Delta Oscar 8 Hotel Kilo 59.
Thank you, you are 59.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Papa 3 Bravo Alpha Hotel.
SP3 Bravo Alpha Hotel 59. Sierra Papa 3 Bravo Alpha Hotel 59.
73.
10-3-88, QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Golf 7 Fox Golf.
Delta Golf 7 Fox Golf 509. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
3.
Delta Alpha 1 DX 509. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Lima Zulu. No, please stand by, guys. Lima Zulu 4 Oli. Again, sorry, with a lot of echo on your audio. Lima Zulu 4 Tauro. Lima Zulu 4 Tango Lima. Yeah, you have a lot of echo on the background of your voice. Your audio is double. Okay, thank you. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Victor Echo 9, Radio Kilo.
EG9 Radio Kilo 5-9.
5-9 Canada, thank you.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Delta Lima. Delta Lima 3. No copy. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Oscar 9 Lima Mike Bravo.
Delta Oscar 9, Lima Mike Bravo 5-9.
59, thank you.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Lima 2 November Golf Papa.
Delta Lima 2, LGP 5-9.
Okay, Roger, also 5-9.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Golf 1 Golf Hotel Sierra.
Delta Golf 1, Golf Hotel Sierra 5-9.
59, thank you.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Alpha. Echo Alpha 4. Negativo, Echo Alpha 4. Negativo, QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Sierra Papa 5, Papa Bravo 5-9. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Alpha 6 Victor Fox 1.
Delta Alpha 6, Victor Fox 5-9.
59273.
Thank you. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Whiskey Papa. Sorry, no copy. Whiskey Papa. Whiskey Papa 4 Echo Charlie. Whiskey Papa 4 Foxtrot Echo Charlie. Sorry, Whiskey Papa 4 again. Okay, I need to turn my antenna on your direction. Sorry, no copy. Whiskey Papa 4, I believe Queen Echo Charlie. Quebec Echo Charlie. Too much noise here. Whiskey Papa 4, Quebec Echo Charlie. Thank you. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
November 9 Papa Golf Golf.
November 9 Papa.
November 9 Papa Golf Golf.
November 9 Papa Golf Golf, 5-9.
5-9, thank you.
Thank you. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Bravo 8, Uniform Bravo.
Uniform Bravo X-ray, what is the prefix?
Kilo Delta 2. Kilo Delta 2. Uniform Bravo X-ray.
Roger, KD2 UBX 5-9.
Thank you. You're 5-5 in New York.
Thank you. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Radio 5, Germany Papa.
Radio 5.
Radio 5, Germany Papa.
Radio 5, Germany Papa 5-9.
Thank you. 5-9, good luck.
Chem 3, QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Italia Uniform 2, Julie Yankee Whiskey 5-9. Grazie, QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Germany 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. QRZ. United Zulu Romeo 5-9.
Papa Bravo 9, Zulu Romeo 59.
Roger, thank you. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Italy United 5, Sierra Fox United.
U5 Sierra Fox Uniform 5-9.
5-9, grazie, buona giornata.
Grazie anche a te. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Italy Washington 0, Hotel Lima Zulu.
Italia Whiskey 0, Lima Zulu 5-9.
5-9, ciao, grazie.
Grazie, QRZ.
Italy Zulu 5, Mike Kilo Alpha.
Italia Uniform, Italia Zulu 5, Mike Kilo Alpha 5-9.
QSL, anche perché 5-9 più 5.
Grazie, QRZ. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. United Norway 7. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Mexico
7.
Mexico 7, Oscar Bravo Fox.
Mike 7, OBF 5-9.
5-9 also, thank you, send me straight.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. Sugar Norway 5. SQ 5 Delta Oscar Papa 5-9. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar November 5, Juliet Whiskey.
Ocean Norway 5, Juliet Whiskey 5-9.
Thank you, 5-8 for you, 73.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha. November Bravo Foxtrot, what is the prefix? Roger, G6 MBF 5-9. Thank you, QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
India Alpha 5, India Tango Yankee.
India Alpha 5, India Tango Yankee 5-9.
5-9 for you, bye-bye.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
3 Kilo Yankee Romeo.
8 Foxtrot Julia 5-9.
5-9, gracias.
Thank you, Romeo Julia. Romeo Julia. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey, Whiskey Alpha.
Echo Sugar 3 Kilo Yankee Romeo.
Echo Sugar 3 Kilo Yankee Radio 5-9.
Roger, Roger. You are also 5-9, over.
Thank you, 7388. QRZ, EG1WWA. Papa Alpha again.
Papa Alpha 1 Alpha Tango.
EG1 Alpha Tango 59. Thank you. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Lima Zulu 5.
Oscar Hotel.
Lima Zulu 5 Oscar Hotel 59. Thank you. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar Hotel.
Oscar Hotel, Oscar Hotel. Oscar Hotel.
Oscar Hotel 3 November Delta Hotel.
Oscar Norway 3 November Delta Hotel 59.
Oscar Hotel 3 November Delta Hotel 59 also, that's
Thank you. Hey, Nunuka. QRZ. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
9 Kilo to Mexico Papa.
9K2 Mexico Papa 59.
9 Kilo to Mexico Papa.
9K2 Mike Papa 59.
Thank you, you're 5 and 9, good luck.
Thanks. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Lima 3, Yankee Alpha Zulu.
Delta Lima 3.
Delta Lima 3, Yokohama Alpha Zulu.
Delta Lima 3 Yankee Alpha Zulu 59.
Roger, your signal also 519. Good.
Thank you. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Golf Mexico.
Full X-ray 6, Florida Radio.
Fox X-ray 6 Fox Radio 59. Fox X-ray 6 Fox Radio 59.
Roger, thank you.
Thanks. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Echo 7-2 Alpha.
Echo 72 Alpha 59.
Thank you, you're 5 and 9 also.
Thank you. The Golf Mike.
Golf Mike 7 Golf Alpha X-ray.
PM70AX 59. Golf Mike 7 Golf Alpha X-ray 59.
59 also 73.
Thank you. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Lima Nancy again. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Sugar Papa 8 Juliet Mike Alpha.
SBA Julia Mike Alpha 59.
Order for you 5
Thank you. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Fox Hotel Delta again. Lima Union 2 Fox Hotel Delta, ¿correcto? USL Lima Union 7 Fox Hotel Delta 59. Igualmente, QRZ Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Italy Kilo 1 Mike Yankee Tango.
Italy Kilo 1 Mike Yankee Tango 59.
59, grazie.
Grazie, QRZ Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Italy Zulu 0 Romeo Delta Mike.
Italia Zulu 0 Radio Delta Mike 59.
5973, buona attivazione.
Grazie, cura di te. QRZ Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Papa 1 Alpha Oscar Lima.
SB1 Alpha Oscar Lima 59.
59, thank you.
QRZ Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Delta Zulu QRP.
Delta Zulu again.
Oscar November 3 Tango Delta Zulu.
Ocean Norway 3 Tango Delta Zulu 59. Oscar November 3 Tango Delta Zulu 59.
Many thanks for 5 and 9. You are 5 plus 20 dB. Best 73.
Thank you. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Mike 0.
Mike Zero Mike Zero.
Mike 0 Alpha Lima Alpha 59.
M0 ALA also 59 QRZ.
Delta Kilo 0 Tango Uniform.
Delta Kilo Zero Tango Uniform 59.
5973.
7388 QRZ Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Italy Uniform 1 Mike Radio Hotel.
P1 Mike Radio Hotel 59.
59.
Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Papa Golf 2 Fox.
Papa Golf 2 Fox 59.
Roger 59 John.
Thanks. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. CQ15 Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. CQ15 Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. CQ15 Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Anybody else? Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha.
Whisky per confermo.
Università Silofono 0 kW Romania.
Università Silofono 0 kW Romania 59.
Ok, muchas gracias.
Italia Uniform 2 Juliet Yankee Whisky.
Grazie 73. Italia Uniform 2 Giulia Yankee Whisky 59.
Sì, grazie, ma volevo sapere se mi avevi messo a log.
Sì, sta corretto. QRZ Echo Golf 1 Whiskey Whiskey Alpha. Echo Alpha Echo Alpha. Echo Alpha Echo Alpha. Muy bajito. Echo Alpha Echo Alpha. Echo Alpha 3, Bravo Lima. Echo Alpha 3, Bravo Lima Lima, ¿correcto? Ok, 3 Bravo Lima Lima 59. Ciao bene, QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Delta 8 Mike Mike.
Mike.
Delta Kilo 8.
Delta Kilo 8 Mike 59.
59.
Thank you, the Oscar Echo. Ocean Echo 5 Papa Zulu Mexico 59. Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Lima. QRZ, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Oscar Echo 3 India Papa Uniform.
Ocean Echo 3 India Papa Uniform 59.
Thank you, 59.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Papa Bravo 3 Mike Alpha Romeo 59.
Thank you for the 59. You are 59 also. Good luck and happy New Year.
Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.
Sierra Papa 5 X-ray Tango Golf.
SP5 X3 Tango Golf 59.
Thank you, you also 59.
Thanks, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Hotel Alpha 2 BJ 59. Thank you, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. CQ15, Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha. Anybody else? Echo Golf 1, Whiskey Alpha.